Welcome to Dialogue Out Loud Interviews. I'm Jennifer Quist. I'm the fiction editor for Dialogue, located in Canada, and happy to be joined today by Brian Habermeyer, William Morris, and Wes Turner, all of whom have contributed recently. Morris and Habermeyer were winners in our fiction contest, and Wes Turner just tells a dang good story. You fit with us thematically tonight, so I hope you don't mind being lumped in with a bunch of winners. So to make some introductions of our guest, William Morris is a familiar name to Mormon literature. He is the current president of the Association for Mormon Letters, busy planning his conference for later in the month. Don't miss that. That's in April of 2023. He has a new book out, Dark Watch and Other Mormon American Stories, and has also edited and collected The Darkest Abyss and Monsters and Mormons, Mormons and States of Deseret. So yes, lots of publications in this particular area that Dialogue lives to serve. Happy to have you joining us from Minnesota tonight. Ryan Habermeyer is the author of the short story collection, The Signs of Lost Futures, and he teaches literature and creative writing at Salisbury University in Maryland. And Wes Turner is with us, MFA graduate from BYU in 2018, who is focusing his studies and his art on the relationship between God and wonder, and he resides in the Salt Lake Valley. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. Yeah. So I like that you're all together because for me, these stories read as a collection, kind of a accidental, serendipitous one. But they, for me, as someone who was involved in the curation of them, they speak of identity out of unity. Well, or rather, identity in and out of unity, and the feeling of finding oneself, finding God, finding the Zion fellowship in the traditional Mormonism, and exploring that through these creative writing tellings that are a departure in our genre, I think. We've, have these excellent EML lectures you can listen to on YouTube about all the various phases of Mormon literature and how it's developed. And without giving too much away about our panel at the AML conference, William, things are starting to move away from some of the creative tropes we had in Mormon fiction with the kind of minimalist realism, the Raymond Carver Mormon writers, that we've had, mediocre men telling their mediocre stories where women stand for things instead of being characters, and where the identity is just kind of assumed as this masculine Mormon Anglophone American subjectivity. And I'm really excited about that. I'm glad to be part of it. Don't get me wrong, we've had some beautiful literature in that subjectivity, and thank you so much for, though you are all in a demographic position to indulge in that, you haven't, and the things that you contributed to Dialogue, and I'd love to talk about them with you. How to juggle the three of us, the three of you. Let's start with Wes Turner. You wrote the shortest one and the one that's not part of the contest, but one that really caught my eye for being so very different, a theme that we're used to seeing coming into Dialogue a lot, something that people are really experiencing and having a hard time expressing in ways that are fresh and that go beyond that masculine Anglophone American subjectivity. So thanks for yours. It's called Sodom and Gomorrah. Do you just want to give us a quick sum up of it? It's very short. Is it like 1,200 words or so?
If that, it's a pretty tight piece. I am jealous of my co-writers today because they seem to be over a longer than a couple paragraphs, which I just don't have the attention span for. But yeah, it's a brief piece. It's a sort of retelling of a narrator who has left Zion and is grappling with sort of the mundane realities of living in Sodom and Gomorrah.
All right. So this one for me was interesting because, and I may be, however I read it might not be the way you read it yourself, but it seems to be situated in the same place most of our Mormon literature is situated in that intermountain area, either inside or outside the chiefly LDS communities there. So it's a story with the same place for me, but just such a different take on it. Like I don't know anything about how dry it is, or the canyons, or the wildlife, or any of the very good nature writing we have that comes out of this area. Is that the place? I mean, like, I don't want to do the whole decoding the author's intention here, but did you mean to put it in the same place with a different eye, or how did that happen? Why did you choose the setting here?
Yeah, I like I say that my interest is sort of this idea of wonder, and I think a lot of that comes from absurdity and from putting together things that are not supposed to be together or that are not intuitively together. And so for me, the place is hopefully universal, and I think some of it feels like Israel, some of it feels like Middle America, some of it feels like, Mormon Utah. But the idea of having a biblical narrative against this really mundane suburban setting, for me, that tension between two familiarities or two tropes is what was exciting for me, and hopefully universalizes it a little bit, makes it a more a broader.
That's what we're all going for, isn't it? Universal. But place.
Can I interject real quick? Do you mind if I interject, Joe? One of the things I noticed with your piece, Wes, when I read it, you're talking about absurdity and these sort of incongruous things. It reminded me, or it made me think it's like a Mormon Bartholomew piece. Like it has that kind of Donald Bartholomew feel to it, this ridiculousness. But the juxtaposition I thought was really fascinating and really startled me in the best of ways. And you shouldn't dismiss the fact that it's short, because I feel like the compression is way more difficult to pull off, almost like a poem, right? As opposed to a longer short story. You get so much room to breathe and expand and sometimes babble on. The compression of it's really great too.
Yeah, and I also noticed kind of the same dynamic where I felt like I could read it as potentially just, suburban Intermountain West, or more universal than that, because it's both so specific and both, and also so biblical. So it also could be like a telling for biblical times, but using modern language, or I even thought it could potentially be somewhat post-apocalyptic. And so it has these kind of little glimmers of potential world building that are very specific and very kind of jagged. But it doesn't land in any specific setting, which I think it makes it all the more interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm just honored to be compared to Bartholomew, so thank you.
Hey, you earned it with it, I mean, it's, I was reading it and I was like, yeah, this is a cool Mormon Bartholomew piece, it's just, I think we're kindred spirits in that regard, with an affection for weirdness and that kind of absurd sort of thing, which I feel like sometimes Mormonism feels really absurd, and I feel that very deeply, and I have felt that since I was a kid, of kind of just like scratching my head sometimes. And I don't use absurd in that sense, or weird like a pejorative sense, because to me, weirdness and absurdity is at the heart of being a human being. So yeah, it was a delight to read.
And that comes through in your own piece too, Ryan. In where you talk about the testimony meeting that your letter writer is describing to the prophet, to the current prophet. And the bizarre stories that are coming across the pulpit at this testimony meeting, which are at once really weird and also very familiar. So when you say later on in the story, how do you put it? Repetition is the first law of heaven, is what your letter writer says at one point. I really like that. And then the repetition that he actually refers to are these weird, crazy, apocryphal 3D fight, Jesus is an alien stories. So the weird is repetitive in the church, and it's just such a turn on that weirdness to make it like, but actually, this is how it is. There must have been grocery stores or something like it in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what were they like? So I think this is a weird way to start this series. And
well, strangely, I did not have to make up. I think I only made up one or two of those testimony meeting stories. The rest are things that I've been told from friends, from siblings, from relatives, so I don't know what to make of that. Like, part of me, I don't know. They're just wild, crazy, sort of folkloric Mormon stories that you hear. And folklore is really huge for me as a writer. It's something that I'm really interested in, both Mormon folklore, but just folklore writ large, and just really interested. So the kinds of oral history, the oral storytelling that gets passed word of mouth, and obviously testimony meeting is often where those kinds of things can occur. So, but yeah, I did make up all of those. A lot of those are true, or at least we're told, I guess I should say.
Yes, they have a ring of familiarity. And they stand out that way. Since we're on Brian's story, would either of you like to give him your reaction?
I just thought it was interesting.
Anyways.
I think all three of these are interesting in the way that there was a magic in them. There was a surreality to each of these stories, or a surreal component. And I think certainly this idea of community and, being part of a community, being out of a community seems to run through each. But I think also this idea, like parsing out what is reality, what is delusion, what's illusion, what is faith. I think that, I think there's so many beautiful lines in your story, Ryan, that are like the yearning and the desire and the longing is so palpable, and the reader is sort of confronted with this tension of like, what of these things is admirable, which of these things is beautiful, and which deserve scrutiny and like mental health services. I thought it was well done.
Thanks.
William?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about sort of the framing the story this way, the way that you did with the letter to President Nelson, because certainly you could have related this in a different way and still told these anecdotes about the boy Jesus, the right. Jesus boy. Why make the frame that way, and what do you think it accomplishes by taking that approach?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, to answer it, there's a practical answer, and then there's a more conceptual one. The practical one is, I found as I've been writing longer and longer that it's become easier to get out fiction pieces when I frame them as in a nonfiction form. So like the letter, there's a facility that comes to it with the writing process itself. When you say this thing is a nonfiction form, I don't know what it is. There's something that's just taking place in my head that it just allows for an easier writing process. And I think we could probably all agree that when your writing is hard enough, and if you find a trick that makes it easier, that by all means keep doing it. So it just helped to frame it as a letter. And it wasn't originally as a letter. I had written it as, more of like a traditional kind of narrative, just a short fiction piece, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like I had the voice, and that's where the conceptual part comes in, right? That I needed to capture that sense of voice and I wanted to capture the unreliability of the narrator as, a guy that kind of knows what's going on, but also doesn't quite know what's going on. I love unreliable narrators, and I thought that this kind of unreliability with it presented as a piece of nonfiction that had that believable quality, but at the same time, it's clearly fiction. That was a nice balance, but being able to capture the voice, the letter really helped me get the voice, and I'm more interested in voice than I am in plot most of the time. I'm more interested in how the person sounds, and so it didn't click until I put it in the letter form.
And it's a brilliant choice. I totally know what you mean. A bunch of the stories in the Darkest Abyss, Strange Mormon Stories, my latest collection come in forms of reports or dialogue, where you just have the dialogue going back and forth, or just various different forms. Specifically with this letter thing, it does help with plot in the sense that it allows for the unfolding of specific plot information, the plot information that you do have, to occur in not quite a random way, but in a way that follows kind of the stream of consciousness of the writer, but still, because it is a letter, have an audience in mind. And I say this as someone who has read a letter like this to the prophet, which when I served a mission in Romania, someone sent an older man that we were visiting sent a letter that eventually found its way to the First Presidency's office and was translated from Romanian into English, and then of course turned back right around and returned back to the mission, and eventually came back into our hands because we knew the individual, and it has that rhythm of someone who sees these things and makes these connections and relates these things that have some grounding in reality, but obviously is maybe a little bit weirder than the reality the rest of us are experiencing. And so I really like the way that you kind of unfolded the information as we proceed through the letter.
And I like the voice allows things to be glossed over too, that I have submitted to me a lot. Like, you could have, as William points out, you could have told us in other ways. We could have gone half by half, basket by basket through the basketball game that you refer to in the story, but we never get to see. We could be involved in the drama of a Pinewood Derby, which is an American term for this. It's not called that in other parts of the world, but I think people pretty much know how those things unfold. And that kind of realistic walk through them has been really well covered already. And the fact that you can talk about that world with these things preserved in it and still important in it, but then with just this freshness of images and references. I love that Wile E. Coyote was in this. That was great. A great American there, Wile E. Coyote. Paired with this beautiful road runner from the Middle East here. And your story was kind of like a retelling of the Joseph Smith Matthew translation in The Pearl of Great Price from the point of view of this desperate person on the side of the road. And yeah, I liked it a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, that's another one of the nice tricks with the form, is that you can breeze through a lot of stuff quickly, like almost anecdotally. You could just move through fast, summarize some things, because earlier drafts were framed as like just the basketball game, or I think just the Pinewood Derby, or I had a couple other frameworks for it, but I realized that I didn't want to frame it like that. I just wanted this more of a told story, just like someone gushing out, confessing almost, to make it work that way. So yeah,
it seemed really new. So for me, yours was like, the small town sports drama story, immigrant out of water story that I see a lot in my submissions, and Wes's was like the disenchanted missionary story that I see a lot, that is really real. A lot of people want to tell this story, and I can't keep publishing it. I can't just crank this story out over and over and over again. I need something move us forward. And Wes's story was like that for me, because you have that sense of a struggle with identity, of a calling out in the wilderness, being a prophet or a missionary, but just in this scene like like I personally have never seen before in this area of literature. So what do you think of that? Have you guys retooled old tropes, or did you have those in mind at all? Ryan says a little bit. What about you, Wes? Or you can react to that too, Ryan. Go ahead, take over.
Cool. Well, I'm pleased to hear that, and well, I'm pleased to hear that the trope that you did not identify in my piece was the queer Mormon experience, which is what I feel like I was revealing. So hopefully I said that in a new.
Yeah, I felt that too. Yeah, and that's something that's generally people want to write for dialogue about. I think it's an excellent venue to have that kind of fiction, but I'm having a hard time finding it, because what it usually comes across in the form of the typical Mormon man, Anglophone protagonist I keep talking about, who meets the magical queer person who doesn't care about their own problems, but is more than willing to step forward and solve all the problems for the protagonist. And this one, yeah, because of and it does feel universal to me in a lot of ways. Maybe it is because of the biblical scope. Because of that, I think, I don't know, I'm not queer myself, but I do write queer theory and I have queer family members, and I would hope that they would feel included by this. So what exactly for you makes this that queer kind of text?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's my access point. I'm a queer former Mormon, Mormon adjacent, cultural Mormon. And yeah, I feel like a lot of, I don't have the whole corpus of queer Mormon literature memorized, but it feels like a lot of it is that the reward is a relationship. And I think that is, I think the real loss that occurs in that transition or in that difficult space is reconciling two identities that are oil and water, and that the real reward, the actual gift of embracing queerness is not an external relationship, but a better relationship with yourself. And so with that orientation, I think it's a huge loss. I just think the boundaries of community are inevitable. And I don't think we often see space for the loss, especially in a queer perspective, of what that community offered that you're leaving behind. And that is the loss. That's why it's hard.
And we do have a lot of burying of queers in Mormon literature that does engage with that. It's that again. So that's the only loss we're experiencing. We're missing all these other things that you brought. Beautiful. Thank you. Any reaction, my other panelists?
Well, I was struck by this idea of this notion of Zion, calling Zion the city of lightning. Yeah. Because lightning is both illuminating and intermittent and searing. And I think a lot of us feel, whether queer or not, that our identities in relation to the church, in relation to the broader culture, in relationship to the struggle of expressing themselves creatively, that we're always both searching for and hoping to avoid the strikes of lightning, if that makes sense.
Nicely put. And let's get to you, William. Thanks for waiting here. You had the first prize story from the dialogue fiction contest called The Ward Organist. And it starts a little conventionally. We don't have the rambling address to the prophet on the side of the road, or the apocalyptic Sodom and Gomorrah in modern time. We have someone learning to play the organ at church. But I'm glad it's included with these other panelists, because I think it approaches identity and identity within what's set up as a traditional Mormon family in much the same way, and that it isn't binary. it should be more descriptive than it is prescriptive. All these things are in your story about a single Mormon woman. And you've written this point of view before, and you've written it for me at Dialogue, and you're really good at it. This is a really hard thing to do, to write outside your own identity. And everything I've seen from you and my short tenure here has been right on. What is it about this character of the single Mormon woman that draws you in, and how do you connect with it so effectively?
So first of all, thank you. Second of all, just one correction with this particular story. You're absolutely correct in your observation about writing that I tend to oftentimes write from the perspective of a female
Did I
a Mormon character
female when it's not?
So if we look closely, this is why it's in first person. The gender is not specified at all, and that is intentional. That the idea was so this started as a science fiction idea, and then I realized that it really, I didn't want it to be. I wanted it to be more literary than that, and just because then I realized it was a pandemic story, which also I swore that I wasn't going to write, but I'm sure a lot of writers are saying that now, and so there was going to be more going on with angels than what just happened, and as I got into it, I realized that what this story is about is hopefully a story about what it is like to be lonely and active, or at least somewhat active in the church, and that it shouldn't specify which gender we're talking about. It could be a female, male, or non-binary.
Oh, you totally got me.
Yeah. And
it's because the last thing I read from you was female point of view, maybe because of my point of view, maybe because the woman she was learning from. See, I'm still calling her she.
Yes, and so we'll say that the main character, and then that's obviously how it also ended up in first person, and it really just comes out of the fact that I've met a lot of amazing single Mormon members in my time active in wards, and my wife and I didn't have children for quite some time as well, and that also has an interesting dynamic to it. And so I wanted about, does God have some compensation for anyone who isn't like the perfect model that gets held up? And if so, of course, what those compensations might be, and that has to be kind of weird, because that's just kind of the way my mind works. And so that's how we ended up with the story. And in terms of being able to write from a female perspective, I think it comes from two places, really, honestly. One, I've had a lot of amazing women in my life. Across all the dimensions of my life that I'm active in, or that I participate in. And the second thing is that I read a lot of fiction that depict women. I read romance novels. I'm a huge fan of a lot of the 19th century female authors, as well as obviously the 20th and 21st centuries as well, but especially the 19th century female authors, especially Edith Wharton. And so that is just a perspective that I've always, even when I was younger, even as a teenager, was just in. And so sometimes it just, when I sit down to write something, that's what I turn to.
And while we're on the personal with you, do you play a keyboard instrument?
I do not. I learned to play the recorder for a year in elementary school.
What a coincidence!
But I have recently, just over the past 18 months, begun to play around as a secondary hobby, because writing couldn't be my only hobby, because I was kind of going a little bit crazy. with just doing writing and work, and I began to play around with making electronic music. So I can't read music, and I can't sit down and play anything, but I do make some sort of music, and it's been great.
Who told you that a piano and an organ are completely different instruments? Then that's a quote from your story that the teacher tells to the narrator. You remember that?
I do. Probably my mom, because my mom plays piano, but has also learned to play organ. Yeah, it probably comes from there.
That struck me as a really apt comparison for being married and being single in the church, perhaps. We talk about how we're all doing the same thing, all in the same community, but a single person is playing that music, something completely different, really, when it comes to their family. And I don't know what that is, but this kind of helped me put that into some kind of perspective. And the debinarizing of everything, of all kinds of identities in terms of the family, which is where our identity mostly comes from, I think. I have great hope in this. The loss that we do suffer for people who can't see themselves in the templates we have in the church. If we can keep doing this kind of work with single people, I mean, perhaps we can not lose each other. Perhaps we can hold on to each other a little more, no matter what choices we make. I don't know. That's me getting like the Sunday school lesson moral here at the end. Nothing, but I'm a mom of a gay boy, and I have this hope. Ryan and Wes, reactions to William's story, if you have them.
I can go first. What I really loved about your piece is what I should say is the way that it moves deeper and deeper into the interiority of, the way that it's set up, like you were saying, as this exploration of loneliness. And I felt like there was a lot of times where the story could have pulled out into some kind of plot that just kept on burrowing, as it were, deeper and deeper into the consciousness. And it has this really nice linchpin stylistically with the older organ player woman too, right? Giving these lessons, and you bounce back and forth between that and these, like you were saying, these weird angels, which I'm actually really glad that you left them kind of on the periphery as this sort of mysterious, mystical thing. Not that they, that they didn't. I can't remember the line exactly, but I just love it. The line that had, they didn't do anything, right? They were just there and they were whispering. Mm-hmm. It's like, I felt that like really palpable in a spiritual sense, that you feel pressed up and close to something divine, but you have no clue whatsoever what it's actually saying. And that's, I think, hollowing out in a lot of ways. And just amplifies the loneliness. So yeah, I love the voice of the character and the way that you explored loneliness. I thought it was really, really great. The restraint, the narrative restraint that you had was just really phenomenal.
Thanks. I was struck. We've already kind of said this, but I'm going to say it explicitly, by the stories from the three of us, and then also the story by Phyllis Barber, about how once you arrive at the point of view and the structure, how much more interesting and powerful and resonant the stories can be. And I think that's what marks all four of these stories. Is just a really nicely honed structure and point of view that then allows the author to really kind of unleash some of the beautiful metaphors and sentences and details and voice, so that you feel like you're experiencing something that isn't, as Janice pointed out, the kind of like, okay, here is the tale told in terms of realism of the plight of the modern Mormon male or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, yes, that too.
I have maybe a question that is adjacent. I'll just start by saying I appreciate I think to have a magical element in a story like this that is so based in the real experience of people, of a protagonist, tonally to be so seamless, I thought that was beautiful. And those descriptions and the fluidity of those angels, I think is perfect. So my question is, and I don't know how to phrase this, but these stories are all very more like steeped in Mormonism, and I think a background and a relationship with the Mormon faith offers deeper insight to these stories. Do you feel that this story is, I guess, where does Mormonism relate to this story for you? Do you feel like Mormonism is a method of achieving sort of a larger theme or idea or concept, or do you feel like this story is a exploration of Mormonism specifically?
That's a great question that I ask about everything, right? So, I guess what I'd say is that I'm a big believer that, and it's probably because I didn't really find Mormon literature until I was in my early 20s. I think that's true of maybe most people. I'd read a couple of things in high school. And also I read I didn't really have any strong reading mentors, I guess until I hit the structure of college again. And so I kind of grew up reading equally literary fiction and sometimes even like experimental literary fiction and genre fiction, especially science fiction and fantasy, but even romance, and some of it very pulpy and some of it more literary. And so I don't know that I can understand other people's reading protocols. And so for me, it's always with my Mormon stuff, it's always a specific exploration of Mormonism, but it's also always intended to be an exploration that if you're willing to come in with sort of maybe a more science fictional or more genre and or literary reading protocol and kind of go with it, that also hopefully there's something universal and interesting to be garnered beyond that as well, is I guess what I'd say. Because it's weird. I don't know. And I think that's something that's interesting about not just Ryan and Wes, but a lot of the other authors that are writing right now. They're active. Louisa Perkins and Steve Peck also come to mind. That yes, there is this weirdness that comes into play, and there is this Mormonism that comes into play. But it's a byproduct, I think, of what these authors are interested in, and less about an almost like where you would get kind of in the 1980s, where it's like, okay, we are in dialogue with what Eugene England has said, and we are doing Mormon literature, right? And I don't see our currently active authors, at least most of them, really at all that interested in that. Even though some of us certainly kind of know that history and have read a lot of that, it's just not what we're interested in. I think the era, to be frank, of quote faithful realism is over, which doesn't mean there aren't Mormons who are active in the LDS Church and are interested in that experience specifically, who aren't writing from that point of view or even writing towards that audience. It's just that in terms of the kind of this notion of creating a specific Zion that is delineated by kind of the 1970s and 1980s conception of Mormon literature is something that any of us are really interested in, because we've grown up with a different church and in eras where the distinctions between high and low art and genre fiction, literary fiction, and weird fiction, experimental fiction are all kind of just blurred together, I think. But that's just my experience and kind of what I've observed from the authors that I've read who are currently writing.
Ryan, you don't write like in the Mormon fiction world so much. Do you have anything to say about this?
Probably. I don't know how intelligent it'll sound. Yeah.
Whenever it's dumb, don't worry. Go ahead.
No, I've always,
Be yourself. Be yourself.
I've always felt like in a weird place with Mormonism in general. I mean, and this isn't like a huge thing, but it's just an example. I mean, I grew up in California, and so I was always labeled by the Utah Mormons as like a California Mormon. You know, like we weren't Mormon enough. You know, when I would go to Utah, I mean, most of my extended family lives in Utah, and it was just like, oh, you know, you're California Mormons, you're not real Mormons. You know, you're sort of these apostate kind of things, and you know, just even the spaces that I grew up in elementary school and middle school, you know, Mormonism was kind of this weird space for me amongst friends, and I had friends at school. So I think like a lot of that influenced the way that when I started writing seriously, I kind of kept Mormonism on periphery. Like I often say for anyone who grew up in the church, you know, or has multi-generational Mormon family, I feel like there's no way that you cannot be Mormon, right? Like there's something deeply embedded. Like even if you step away from faith or leave entirely, there's still this part of Mormonism that I feel like is just clenched onto your soul in some way. Like it's just so like to me, like Mormonism's always there in the background. It's always been there in the background. If I look back at like some of the oldest stuff when I started writing seriously like 20 something years ago, I can still see like the little echoes, you know, almost like little Mormon Easter eggs that I'd like hidden in the work. But it hasn't been until recently, probably the last 3 or 4 years, that I've felt like I could claim that identity in fiction, but I felt like I needed to stake some kind of, not a position's not right, but that I needed to explore it more. So I'd have writing that, you know, like what I submitted to dialogue that requires a kind of deeper understanding of Mormonism, like Wes, like you were talking about. I think like if a non-Mormon reader came to my piece, that they get lost in a lot of the references and maybe some like the weirdness of it too would just sort of blow over, you know, like the moment where the guy's talking about swinging the sword of Laban, for example. Like no one outside of Mormonism is gonna be like, huh? You know, but you know, hopefully, you know, Mormons are like, oh, okay, yeah, we got that involved, you know, or whatever. So yeah, it's just been recently that I've become a lot more interested in trying to push some of that peripheral Mormonism in my work more into the center of it. I mean, it's something I've been doing with the collection of stories that I've been working on, and that I've, you know, it's sort of making its way in the trying to get published world right now. This other collection I've been doing is it pushing more in that direction of how can I explore Mormonism for a broader audience.
Right. And we did want to hear before we finish up about the future plans that the three of you each have. So just can you announce that book like in a way that we can cut it in and just kind of elegantly talk about it, Ryan?
Yeah. So it's, oh gosh, it's another collection of short stories. It's called Salt Folk. And
Awesome.
about it's the way that I frame it is a speculative history of Utah past, present, and future. So it has like stuff from 19th century. There's like a found manuscript kind of thing, and then there's just all sorts of stories like a kind of sideways present of Utah. There's a lot of I didn't realize this until late in the process. There's a lot of climate fiction kind of stuff in it. You know, it's framed with a lot of sort of the original title before I changed it was Jesus Wants Me for a Catastrophe. So and then I changed the title because I got some suggestions from editors like no one's going to read that book, and so I said, okay, what else could I do with it? So yeah, it's sort of catastrophic climate fiction, short stories. Yeah, sorry. That's going to be like a totally botched thing that you're going to good luck editing that into like a coherent state.
Has it found a home yet, or are you still editing it, or like what stage is it at?
It has been a finalist for 4 different contests, but just this week I got a publisher that wants to publish it. So I haven't signed anything yet, or no. So I'm hopeful. I got fingers crossed. I got to see details of the contract and stuff, but hopefully.
Yeah.
Good. Send it to us to review when it's ready, for sure.
Absolutely.
Wes, do you have anything underway or plans for the future in art?
Yeah, I believe Allison Brimley has been published in dialogue before. We did the MFA BOA together, and we still meet once a week. So we're both working on Mormon adjacent novels right now, and hopefully those will be written and published someday.
Awesome.
So is that like more of this kind of fantasy, epic, mythic kind of tone, or something more realistic?
Yeah, I not to be too long-winded, but I watched Under the Banner of Heaven, the Hulu series, and this is cliche, but Toni Morrison says to write the book you want to read, and right. I watched that series and I was like, this isn't it. Like there's real fodder here, there's real soil for rich stories, and this is not it. So, yeah, I'm interested in the idea of a religion that is true, and people who still have to just determine whether or not it works for them. So
cool.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And William, you must have 100 things on the go.
So yes. Trying to think. Okay. So here's what the plan is, and I probably should say this out loud, but whatever. I'm in control. I am planning on self-publishing a novelette called The Unseating of Dr. Smoot. It is another from the point of view of a female academic who goes to Utah to have a quasi job interview with UVU and also give a presentation at BYU. And then there is...
What's UVU?
Utah Valley University. Sorry, I'm using acronyms. And then it is sort of a cousin to my Mormon Lit Lab book mentoring novel, which will either be published before or after that, after The Unseating of Dr. Smoot, probably after, called The Courtship of Elder Cannon, which is about a general authority who is widowed and who gets set up by an apostle and the apostle's wife with a professor at the University of Utah, and they begin courting. And so it's basically 2 novels, one is a short novel and the other is a novelette about Mormon liberals and the 21st century, and the experience for somewhat older Mormons as well. So hopefully, at least one of those this year will be I'll self-publish, and then the other one will probably come out next year. So
great, lots to look forward to, and thanks so much. I was really happy to discover the 2 of you I didn't know, and happy to find that the blind story I was enjoying so much was someone I was already a fan of. So thanks so much. Send us your work in the future. That's not like an editorial letter cliche. I really need it. So keep writing, and keep writing for me. Thank you so much.